Okay, number 5, keep going. Keep going. We're almost there. Roll up your sleeves. Don't think about this stuff too much. We still very often retain this belief that we can put the bits of the fallen Humpty Dumpty back together again, and that we can restore what's been lost. Nature in this respect is still often presented as this relatively static puzzle that's waiting for us to just make it whole again. Unfortunately, what the science of the last 30 to 40 years has shown is that on most levels, ecosystems really can't be restored. They are unrepeatable. More often than not, we don't even know how our ecosystems work today, much less how they worked in the past. We do know that 95% of our species richness in New Zealand is comprised of invertebrates, but probably at least half of those species we're yet to even classify, much less figure out how they contribute to their ecosystems. We generally don't know what our baselines look like either. Most of the time our baselines are grounded in extrapolations from isolated fossil and subfossil deposits, along with some pretty rudimentary documentation of what species might have existed in any particular area, in any particular time from historical records, if the aim is for a more recent baseline. Our baselines, to further complicate matters, are generally very poorly defined. When people talk about restoration at any particular site, it's often very vague what the baseline actually is. In my experience, if you talk to 10 different people about the baseline in any particular site, they're likely to give you 10 different answers. One person will tell you it's pre-human, for another it'll be pre-European, somebody it'll be restoration of function, whatever that means, or resilience, even more meaninglessly, to just having more native birds around, more trees or something of that nature, something more straightforward like that. Of course, there's nothing wrong with having different baselines, but the fact that we often aren't clear on what they are, how we can determine what they are, or what they were, and even how to consistently communicate what we're trying to do is a real problem, I think. Our dreams of restoration are also up against mass introductions, numerous extinctions, most notably of many of our former keystone species like moa, and constant further arrivals of species arriving both on their own steam and slipping through our biosecurity system. The overarching behemoth of climate change also floats over the top of all of this. We're irritated that introduced species don't care about our baselines, but we're also increasingly irritated that natives don't seem to care about them either. Some people might remember that we used to have weka up at the sanctuary in Zealandia. Those birds turned out to be a real pain in the arse because they were constantly eating their native bedfellows. It was a real issue. Anyone who's tried to do wetland restoration will know that native pukeka are a similar nuisance, ripping up our attempts to plant native wetland plants. And anyone who's tried to save New Zealand dockerel along our coastlines will know that they're imperilled by the constant threat of native harriers eating their chicks and eggs. To the horror of many conservationists, natives have also taken to mating with many other species, both native and introduced. Many of you will be aware that the Department of Conservation have an issue with native pied stilts mating with endemic black stilts down in Twizel, and thus supposedly sullying their respective pure genotypes. We actually have an officer, or at least we did have an officer down there stationed with a shotgun waiting to police any of these wayward matings. Similarly, introduced mallards have taken to mating with native grey ducks, and we used to think it was those despicable, debauched mallards behind all of this, until we came to realise that many of the matings were actually between grey duck drakes and mallard hens. So at times we've been forced to admit that hybridizations have often been the result of a mutual appreciation for the exotic. So when we try to stop them, is this because we know better than these species themselves? We sometimes have to ask ourselves. And as Chris Smelt, the historian that I circulated another paper to you recently about, noted in one of his papers, where is the loss from the perspective of the birds themselves? Another thing we know about restoration is that it's hugely expensive and time-consuming. Zealandia here in Wellington is another really great example of the costs involved. The sanctuary sits literally within the wealthiest per capita population in New Zealand and also has huge local buy-in, and yet Zealandia has constantly struggled financially. It really speaks to the difficulties in making these things work long-term and to the scale and scope of any initiative if it genuinely wishes to be sustainable. And lastly, we hold out hope for the silver bullet, that perfect new technology that we're constantly reminded is just around the corner and that will assuredly wipe out all these pests for good at some time very soon. It's an important part of the government's recent Predator-Free New Zealand endorsement and something that has been promised for decades. And I don't know, maybe we will get there this time, who knows. But usually what happens with silver bullets is that they turn out to be either unconscionably risky, unethical, expensive, or all of the above. Now, none of this, again, amounts to the suggestion that we shouldn't attempt to restore ecosystems in some circumstances and in some areas. But at the least, I wonder whether we need to start pegging back our desires for restoration, better defining what our goals are, and defining circumstances where it may be more appropriate to actually not restore.